Hi there, it's Tracy Kiernan from stepbysteppainting.net, and this acrylic painting tutorial is going to show you how to paint a Christmas wreath with acrylics on an 11 by 14 inch canvas. So I did a rustic red background, and you are welcome to change the color of that if you want to do like a gray or a black background with this. And I'm going to go ahead and go over the brushes and colors that I use for this tutorial. I only used two brushes for this, a 3/4 flat wash and a 4 round. All the brushes and colors are listed in the description of this tutorial as well. I used 8 colors, and of course these colors might change if you're changing the background color in the ornaments and the lights. But these are the 8 colors I used: Alizarin Crimson, Cad Red Medium, Raw Sienna, Cobalt Blue, Hooker's Green Hue, Cad Yellow Light, Titanium White, and Mars Black. And for the donut shape of the wreath, I used a 9-inch paper plate and a 7-inch styrofoam circle to create that donut shape. If you wanted to cut out the inner circle of a paper plate, you can do that as well. But find something similar in size. You don't have to have the exact same measurements. You just need a large and a small circle to trace, and that's really going to help you get that donut shape down. And I used a piece of chalk to draw the bow. So we're going to go ahead and start with our blank canvas. I'm working on the 11 by 14 inch size. This design can work on literally any size canvas, so you don't have to use this exact size. And you also can change the color of the background. So I decided to do a rustic red background. If you want to do gray or a different color, just a color that's going to contrast against that green is what I recommend. But I have 4 colors on my palette. I have 2 different reds. I have the Alizarin Crimson and the Cad Red Medium, and I have white and black. So white and black is going to help get that kind of rustic, old looking color. It also create some interest, so it's not just a solid color. Unless you want to simplify this and just paint your canvas a solid color, that is fine too. So I'm using the 3/4 wash brush, and I'm going to paint this entire canvas with all up and down strokes. And my goal is to blend all these 4 colors together to create a blended look, but without blending it all together. Some areas of the canvas I want to look darker, some I want to look lighter, so that's going to create some nice variation. The Cad Red and the Alizarin Red blend nicely together to create some dark and bright reds. When blending in your black, you only want a very, very tiny amount in there. So with the black, I grab just a teeny bit on the corner, mix it with the red on my palette. It's going to create a very dark red. You just don't want too much black, because that black is just going to take over and be too dark, and it's going to be hard to blend that out into your red color, unless that's the look you're going for. But see how that black kind of just blends with the red? We have different kind of streaks of the darker color in there. And then when we start introducing our lighter color, the white, that's going to blend nicely as well. So I guess the goal is to kind of create a rustic wood red background. And the focus of this is going to be the wreath. So we're not going to do wood grain or details in the background other than snow. But if you wanted to do the wood grain or divide it up into panels, you're welcome to do that. Or even do, if it's a wreath that's hanging on a door, you can do the rectangular door panels if that's what you want to do. But I'm just going to continue to paint all up and down strokes. There's really no right or wrong way of doing this. You just want to keep your paint relatively thin. And since I'm working on one of these canvas panels and not the stretched canvas, so it's the flat canvas that's stretched over just a piece of heavy cardboard, I find with these canvas panels that the paint doesn't flow as easily as the stretched canvas. So I find myself using more paint when I do this, when I work on these. But to help get it to spread, you can add just a teeny bit of water to your brush. So as I go and load, I sometimes will just grab a little water on the tip of the brush and help get that color to glide easier across these canvases. But the trick is that you don't want to overblend it. You have areas that are lighter, areas that are darker. The white blends in so pretty with this red. So you're just going to continue to fill all this up. Just want to make sure your strokes are going across the canvas and just fill up your entire canvas with this technique. I'm going to go ahead and go silent as I finish up this step. So right here is an example of what might happen if you add too much black to your canvas. So there's a big glob of black and that's really hard to blend. So you could quickly rinse your brush off, dry, and then just add the red to that. But I'm going to do the best I can to see if I can blend this in with the rest of the canvas by just grabbing red, possibly some white to get that to blend out. So we have a dark smudge in here, just blending it up into the rest of the color. That's why you just need to be really careful not to add too much black to your background. So that extra pop of red and that white kind of going over that black help to combat that extra darkness. And then I'm going to show you one more thing that we can do. So on the edges, on the top and on the bottom, I'm dry brushing this white and just kind of dragging it down. It's going to create maybe like a frosted look, adds to the rustic effect. But you're just adding white to the tip of the brush and you're just quickly swiping it down, just using the tip of that, dragging that white down. It's dry brush, so it's not really blending with the rest of the color, and it's just adding interest to the edges. You can do that on the top and the bottom. Just taking that white, quickly dragging it down. It's dry, it's not blending. That color below it is drying very quickly. So just on the edges, dragging it down. So if you wanted to, you can add vertical lines to create wood panels for this, but I'm going to go ahead and just leave it like this, and we're going to focus on the painting of the wreath. So you can do 2 lines down the middle. You want to wait for this to dry before doing your circles. So once your canvas is dry, you can go ahead and locate 2 circles. So I'm using a paper plate, this one, is 9 inches and this one is 7 inches. You can also cut out the center part of the plate if you want to do that. But basically we need to draw a donut shape to help us with the boundaries of our wreath. And again, you don't have to use this exact size. You can use a compass. If you want a smaller wreath, you can use a smaller circle. Same if you want a larger one. This paper plate just happened to work out very nicely for this canvas size. So I'm just using a regular pencil and tracing the circumference of the circle. And then I'll get my styrofoam bowl. This one is 7 inches. And so kind of center this, kind of use my fingers to make sure that it's in the center. This is going to create a donut shape. So if you want a more fuller wreath, you can find a smaller circle for the center. So that makes your boundary lines, that'll make your wreath look thicker. So if you want that to be thicker, you can, but this is going to help us with the painting of our circular wreath. So when you're done with that, we're going to go ahead and do the green layer first. So this wreath was painted in layers, starting with dark green and then adding layers of lighter green on top until we get to kind of a very, very light green at the very top. So you want to go ahead and load your palette with black and Hooker's Green Hue Permanent. And we're using the 3/4 inch flat wash brush. So on your palette, you want to make a dark green. You want to add about 3 parts green and 1 part black. Just add teeny bits of black to the corner of your brush and mix it in with your color. Mix it all together and it's going to create a very, very dark green. You don't want black, but you want a very, very dark green. We're going to go ahead and practice this on the back of our canvas. So you can turn your canvas over or just grab a piece of sketch paper to do this. But the way these strokes work is we're using the full width of the brush and we're going to be dragging the brush. So using the tip of that and dragging it, and it's going to create that kind of feathery texture. By using the tip of the brush, it's going to create a row of pine needles, and basically we're going to start at one point of the wreath and we're going to go like this kind of around in the circle. So I'm creating kind of rows. It's very similar to painting a pine tree, a kind of a Christmas tree, but we're doing this in a circular direction. So each of my strokes are using the tip of the brush and just kind of dragging it to create different angles of those pine needles. So I'll go ahead and turn my canvas over, go ahead and load the tip of the brush in this dark color, and it's going to show up very dark, especially since our background is a reddish, dark red background. This is going to show up very dark and it's not going to give you full 100% coverage. You can also use the tip of the brush to create vertical strokes. So instead of using the full width, you can use a variety of full width, and then you can turn your brush on its side and use the tip to make more vertical strokes. So creating that variety in there. So I started on the lower left 7 o'clock position of my donut. You can start there if you want, or you can start at the top, doesn't matter. But we're basically going to go in a clockwise direction, and we're angling each of our strokes going in the same angle, but I'm moving along this donut going in a clockwise direction, and you can overlap previously done strokes, and you are allowed to go outside of your boundary lines. That's going to create that kind of textured look in the wreath, but we drew the donut for a reason, so you want to stay along that path and not go out of the lines too much, if that makes sense. So you can go outside the lines a little bit, but for the most part we are going along that donut shape that we drew earlier. So your wreath isn't going to look realistic or anything right now. This is the first layer. It should look textured the way your strokes are being made. You can vary this a little bit. So if you want to add a little bit of black in some areas and then kind of let up on the black in others, you can. But keep in mind that we're going to be painting multiple layers over this. So don't add any white or lighter colors in here yet. This is all dark colored. So as I'm going around this circle, the angle is changing slightly to go in that direction. So the angle that I started out with is not the same angle right now because it's the angle that goes along the circle, if that makes sense. And again, you can go back over previously done paint strokes. That creates more texture. For the most part, my background, you can see a little bit of that background below the green because green, it tends to be kind of a translucent color, but I am pretty much covering up everything inside of that donut. And my poor brush is working very hard because I'm just using the tip of those bristles and I'm really kind of pounding this brush. But that's kind of necessary to create this texture. So you're just using the tip of those bristles, kind of going in kind of a zigzag formation. So I'm going left, right, right, back to the left, and then down to the right, and then right, left, and then you're going to meet where you first started, and you can overlap that part where you started. So you created your first layer of the wreath, and as long as you stayed along that donut shape that we created, your wreath should be a circle. You can go back over some of these with more texture. Kind of doing some more edging on that. So if you want your wreath to look like it has more texture kind of hanging out of the circle, you can go back and create some branch pieces that are sticking out. So we're going to do our next layer. You want this to dry a little bit. It's not going to work well if it's soaking wet, so kind of let it dry. It doesn't need to dry completely, but just a little bit. If it was too wet, the dark color will mix too much with our next color. So you want to add titanium white to your palette, and we're going to make our medium green layer and add some more of that Hooker's Green Hue Permanent. And use our brush. Notice I rinsed that off the brush. You want to get that dark green all off so that it doesn't mesh with this medium green. So I'm going to make a medium green color, about equal parts green and white, maybe a little bit more green. Keep in mind that we're going to add another layer on top that's going to be lighter than this. So this should be about 3 to 4 shades lighter, but we're going to get even lighter after this. So I'm going to start in the same spot, and I'm going to do the exact same thing again, but less. So I'm not adding as much as I did the first time around because I want to see my first dark layer between these strokes, and that's going to create the effect that it's has depth. So we're essentially highlighting our wreath right now, and that first layer was the shadowy part, the darker part of it. So I'm doing the exact same thing. I could have my strokes go backwards if I wanted that to. So some of these can go the opposite direction. But for the most part, they're kind of all going the same direction. And I'm going in that clockwise direction, going back over. But again, not covering all of my dark green. If I covered all that dark green, I wouldn't be able to see any of that shadowy part. This is going to kind of give your wreath a realistic look, make it look a little bit 3D. And you can vary that. You can add a little bit more white. So see how that's so much brighter than the other ones? You just don't want to go too bright yet because our third layer is going to be a brighter color. So just add only teeny tiny bits of that lighter green. And we can do some of the edges. We can go outside the boundary a little bit to create texture on our wreath. So there's our second layer. And then our third layer. So you want to add more white to that color that you created on your palette. So this should be a couple tints lighter. See how much lighter that is? It's not pure white, but it's a super bright green. And we're going to do this same thing again. So again, if this was soaking wet, I wouldn't do this step, but mine is drying really fast right now. So I'm able to do this. If yours is not drying this fast, you can dry it really quick with a hair dryer, come back, take a short 5-minute break and come back, because this won't work if all those layers are just mixing together. So I'm going to kind of cheat and go backwards a little bit. But basically, same thing again with this bright green, but you want to add less, because if we added the same amount as our first layer, it'll just cover everything up. So we want to see our dark layer and we want to see our medium layer. So this is really creating texture and depth in our wreath. We can have our strokes go different directions, but it's pretty much the same kind of technique. And you can vary this. If you wanted to add darker pieces in there or lighter pieces, you can. There will be another layer on top of this using mostly just the white, but that layer will use a very, very small amount of. So there is our bright green layer, created nice texture, some pretty dimension in this. You can see all those different levels of green in your wreath. So our final layer is going to be mostly white. Adding a few more pieces, just using the tip of the brush, kind of hanging out over the edges. Use just the tip of the brush, that creates your thinner stroke. Not really adding a lot of paint to my brush either. All right, so this one, without rinsing the brush, I'm just loading it in the green and the white. So that white is mixing a little bit with green, so it's essentially a really, really light green, but I just loaded my brush in the white. So you only want a little bit of this. This will give it kind of a snow dusted effect, using just the tip of the brush, kind of adding this sporadically throughout the wreath. But I don't want to overpower some of my darker colors in there. Don't want this white to completely take over. Just a few strokes of that white. It's really going to help highlight it, give it that snow dusted effect. So you can see all the pretty different layers of green in your wreath, and you want this to dry before going on to next steps. So the next step is the fun part. We get to decorate our wreath. So I'll show you what I did to decorate my wreath. You're welcome to change this, to customize colors, to not do the pine cones if you don't want to do the pine cones, or do bigger pine cones, or maybe just one pine cone. You could add a poinsettia. There's so many different things you can do to this wreath. I'm just going to show you the techniques and what I did. So, and of course, you're most certainly welcome to copy me. So pine cones, I'm going to do a very simple decorative pine cone. It does not look realistic, but we can tell that it looks like a pine cone. So that's always fun when it actually looks like it. So for the pine cone, we're going to go ahead and practice this on the back of our canvas, but we need raw sienna and Mars black. We want to make a really dark brown. So when we add black to raw sienna, it darkens that color to make it look like a darker brown. Add little bits of black into it until it looks dark enough, but don't turn it all the way black. So it should be a very dark brown. And you want to go ahead and paint a cone shape. So this is the shape, the basic. It's almost like we're just painting an egg right now. So it's kind of flat and rounded at the bottom. It kind of goes up to not a point, but it kind of a curved point at the top. And that's painted solid. So that's our first layer. And then you want to go ahead and let that dry a little bit, but because I'm working on the back of the canvas, it's not drying as fast. So I'm just going to use my hair dryer to dry this really quick so that I can demonstrate to you how this works. It also helps to look at an actual pine cone just to kind of observe the shape and what the little scales do. So then I'm going to take raw sienna and add a little bit of white to it. I actually didn't rinse my brush off, so there's still a little bit of dark brown on my brush. You can do that too, or you can just mix raw sienna with white. Both ways end up working about the same. You want to start at the top, and you want to create the little kind of rib notches, scales that are sticking up. So there's about 2 or 3 little angle pieces that are sticking up on the top part of the cone. And then the other ones are just kind of horizontal curved strokes inside the cone, and they're kind of staggered. The ones on the edges can be hanging out a little bit. And as you work your way down, your little strokes that you're making are going to get closer and closer together and also smaller. This is a denser part of the pine cone where they're closer together. So there's my second layer. And then the third layer, we're going to add more white to the tip of the brush. And we're just going to go back over just on the top part of our little scale pieces that we painted. That's going to highlight each individual piece, just a little tiny stroke on the top part on each of those. And there is our simplified pine cone. Because we're doing so many of these and they're tiny, we don't really need to go in and render it further or make it super realistic unless you want to. But that is enough to make it look like a little pine cone. So we can put these on our wreath. We can go ahead, and it's going to look better with the contrasted dark background. It looks a little different on the white background. So we can go ahead and turn our canvas over, and we can do our base layer. So I'm gonna rinse all that off, get my dark brown again. So remember, we mixed a little bit of black into that raw sienna. I'm adding a little bit of water in there to kind of thin it down a bit. That's gonna make our super, super dark brown color. And then we can go ahead and paint our cone shapes. So if you want to make these larger, you can. I just did them this size. And we can have them so they're attached to the wreath, but they can be hanging off the edges. They're allowed to go outside the boundaries if you wanted to do that. So I did like a cluster of pine cones down here, and then a few sporadic ones throughout the wreath. You can do as many or as little as you want, but all of these are the first layer, so that dark cone shape. So it's almost like we're painting Easter eggs. And you can make some of them a little bit larger, some a little bit smaller. They don't all have to be the same size, and they don't all have to be going the same direction. So just kind of create variety by making them go different angles. So this one is hanging off the wreath over here. And one over here. So I'm going to go silent here for a little bit as I add all of my pine cone shapes. You want to also keep in mind that I'm going to be adding a bow here, so I'm not going to put any pine cones where my bow is going to be. It might be helpful to draw your bow with a piece of chalk, and I'll do that in a couple steps from now. But just keep in mind if you're adding a bow and if you're changing the placement of the bow, you just don't want to add pine cones where you're planning on putting anything large or significant. So I didn't put in any pine cones in the lower left part of, or the lower right part of the circle. And you want to wait for your brown to dry. It doesn't have to be completely bone dry, but if it's soaking wet, this won't work either. So wait for it to dry a little bit and then rinse your brush off and do your light layer. So we will be mixing raw sienna with titanium white. It's going to make a light brown color. And then pick a pine cone. Remember, we start at the top of the pine cone, so you can turn your canvas around to kind of help you. So you have your little 2 or 3 little pieces that are sticking up more vertically, and then do your little tiny strokes going in kind of a staggered pattern down to the base of your pine cone. So it is important that that brown, dark brown layer is showing through. That's going to create that shadowy part of the pine cone. And as you get to the bottom part, the base, your little strokes are thinner and more dense, so they're closer together. So you're just going to do this to each of your individual shapes. Each stroke kind of staggered like bricks, offset from each other. And then on the base, much closer together. So you're just going to repeat that technique for all of your pine cone shapes. With some of these, I'm already kind of varying the color. So this one, I added a little bit of white just on the edges of it already. We are going to go back and add our little white highlight layer, but it also works if you kind of double load your brush in the raw sienna and the white, and that also creates that kind of two-toned look in your scales. And then you'll go ahead and do each individual one. Some of them turned out kind of sloppy and messy, but that's okay. Pine cones don't all have to look the same. And then we can add our white layers. So you don't need to add the white to every single little scale that you painted on each pine cone. You can just do it on a few of them. So I did it on that one and then this one. You don't really want to mess up your pine cones. So just a teeny tiny bit of white adds just a pop of dusted snow on your pine cones. You can even opt out of this step if you don't want to add the white to these, if you want to just keep it simplified, or if you like the way your pine cones turned out and you don't really want to mess them up. So just a very, very tiny amount of white. It should not be covering all of that brown, just a teeny tiny pop of white kind of here and there on the scales of all your pine cones. So we're done with the pine cone step, and we can add the next little decorative element. This one is super easy. I'm going to be using Cad Red Medium Hue to paint the little berries. So also use the number 4 round brush for this. And you're just going to take your red, add that red just on the tip of the brush, and you're painting little clusters of circles. So some of these are actual circles, some of these I just made little dots. So to create variety in the berries, I changed the sizes. So some are tiny circles, some are small and not so tiny. If you want to do larger circles, you can. And some of these are just dots. So you want to paint them kind of in clusters of 2s and 3s, or as an individual berry, but all throughout the wreath. And also keep in mind that our bow, we can go ahead and draw this bow in, because the further we get with these decorations, the more we might forget that we're going to add a bow here. So switching gears here, I used a piece of chalk to draw the bow, and this one is just kind of the lower right part of the wreath, and it's kind of going at an angle. So I drew the little circle in the center, little triangular rounded cornered pieces on each side, and the pieces that are hanging down that are flowing and then flowing to the left. You can change the style of the bow if you want. You can make it larger or smaller. You can also change the placement. If you'd rather paint like a poinsettia flower right here, you're welcome to do that as well. And then we can just go in and paint the rest of our berries. Then I'm going to add like a little frosted look to the tops of the berries. So I'm going to wipe the brush off and load it in just titanium white. So I'm just creating 2 or 3 little white dots on the top of each of those berries. Gives them just a frosted look, like little snow pieces landing on the berries, or even just a highlight helps get that little red circles to pop a little bit. And then we can paint our bow in. So I did red for the bow, so Cad Red Medium Hue. So there's a little bit of a challenge here because the background is red and the bow is red. So we're going to have to, when we get to the string pieces that are hanging down, we're going to have to do something with our black and white to either highlight it or darken it to create contrast in that area so that it stands out. So right now I'm just painting the centerpiece and the side pieces. I grabbed a little bit of white right there on the tip of the brush, just letting that white and red kind of gently blend together, create some lighter tints in that red. Same with this side, just doing wet on wet blending, letting the colors just kind of blend on the canvas and do their thing. So red and white blending together, creating different variations. And then I could start painting in the pieces that are hanging down. So let's start by using that white to kind of lighten that color, see what happens. So I can do this, and then I could loosely outline the edges of it with black so that that stands out, or I can loosely outline the edges with white so that it stands out from that background. So if I add a little bit of black to the red over here on the right, kind of creates a darker, shadowy part of that. That will also help it to stand out. We'll do that over here as well, kind of blending that right onto the canvas. So depending on your background, if your background is super dark in that area, you might want to just add white to your bow tie pieces so that it's lighter, it has contrast. Or if your background is super light, you can do the opposite and make it darker. You can also change the color of the bow. If it's a blue bow, it would definitely stand out. And I'm just using the black to kind of outline the bottom part of that circle, bottom part of the triangular pieces. So just letting it kind of blend on the canvas. Just want to be careful not to add too much black in there because it might take over, make it too dark. So like right here, it got too dark fast. So I can add more red to my brush if needed to kind of lighten that up. I can use the white on the top part of these pieces, kind of blend and highlight the left in the top part of that. So it's just red that's kind of varied, shadowing with the black and highlighting with the white. And that gives it enough contrast to stand out from the background. When this dries, we can erase our chalk line. And so we'll just let that dry before doing that. Let's move on to the lights. So the lights are really fun. I use Cad yellow light hue for the lights. If you want colored lights, then you can add to your palette all sorts of colors. If you want blue, red, orange, pink lights, you're welcome to do that. But I'm going to do just warm yellow lights throughout. So for the lights, we want to add a blurry layer first. And sometimes it helps to add white into your yellow. It makes it bright. But you want to just take your brush and paint a tiny circle. I'm doing this multiple times because there is a lot of water on my brush. So it was dripping down and watering that paint down. So it wasn't really working at first. But you're just making your stroke and you're just taking your finger. So before that paint dries, taking your finger and just smearing it out, and it's going to create a very translucent glowing yellow circle. I had to wipe my brush off because that water was causing it to not show up. So that's a little bit better. So adding yellow, and you might have to do this multiple times. So you can go back over some of yours, and that makes it brighter. It's a second coat over the first one that I did, but I'm still using my finger to press and smear outwards, and that creates that glowing outer layer. So each of these, and the technique is the same. If you're doing colored lights, you would just be doing the same thing. So if you're doing blue, you would be making a little blue dot and you'd be taking your finger and smearing it. So make as many lights as you want all throughout the wreath. We will be adding a little white dot inside of each of those lights, and that'll really make it look like it's glowing. So I'm just going back over some of these with some of them even got a third layer. That third layer makes it extra bright. So it's just a teeny tiny dot of paint and you're smearing it out. And then, so you can wipe your brush off, get that yellow off the brush, add white just to the tip of the brush, and inside each of those blurry yellow dots, you're going to add a little white dot. And that is going to be the brightest part of your light. If you want to smear that white dot too, you can too. But the effect is the same as just adding that white dot right in the center. And that'll really make it look like you have glowing Christmas lights on your wreath. Such a pretty effect that it creates. I am going to go ahead and very carefully erase my chalk lines with a wet wipe or baby wipe. You can do the same. It also works with a wet paintbrush, but I find that if you use a wet paintbrush, some of the residue from the chalk is left over. With the wipe, it wipes off that residue so it doesn't show up when it dries. Just be very careful. Make sure your bow is dry before doing that so you don't smear your paint. And then I'm going to add some blue ornaments to the wreath. So if you want to do different color ornaments, you're welcome to. This little pop of blue